Thank you for coming and giving me the opportunity to share with you. I'm not at all imagining that all that I'm going to say is new, because many are widely read, and perhaps in your own sphere of work, you will already know things that I will mention during this week. But what I hope to do is to integrate all these different facets of knowledge and to try to give a perspective that will help each individual to understand better, one, how the body works, the laws of the body; two, how they interact with the laws, the physiological laws of the mind; and as a result, the implications, the physiological laws of the brain, and as a result, the implications for our mind. I think many people struggle. They struggle both spiritually, emotionally, and physically because they don't quite understand what is going on. And when there is little understanding, there can be much confusion and therefore difficulty in coping with life, and even greater difficulty in coping with God and trying to understand what God offers us. So overall, this is what I'll hope that our sessions together will achieve. You know the biblical statement very well. When God made man in his own image to reflect his glory. What happened when Adam and Eve sinned? Let me just remind you of a statement which, once again, is not new, but to set the stage for our teaching this afternoon. It was a wonderful thing for God to create man, to make mind. He created man that every faculty might be the faculty of his divine mind. The glory of God is to be revealed in the creating of man in God's image and in man's redemption. It was a wonderful thing for God to make mind. Every faculty of man's mind was meant to be a manifestation of the faculty of the divine mind. Next, Jesus became a man that he might mediate between man and God. He clothed his divinity with humanity. He associated with the human race that with his long human arm he might encircle humanity, and with his divine arm grasp the throne of divinity. And this Jesus did that he might restore to man the original mind which he lost in Eden. So whatever the mind is, and whatever God gave us, whatever faculty, which once reflected his mind, we lost that original mind. In the last quotation, having lost it, what happened? When man sinned, all heaven was filled with sorrow. For through yielding to temptation, man became the enemy of God, a partaker of the satanic nature and the satanic mind. So once we were made with the original mind, which reflected the mind of God. We lost it, and in turn, we received a carnal mind, one that reflected the mind of the evil one. These are spiritual realities. And against this background, I want to look at physiological mechanisms in our brain and our body which impinge on the function of the mind, because, of course, the mind is a function of the brain. The brain is not something abstract. It is physical. It's very soft. It's almost like butter. If you squeeze it too hard, it just crumbles. It is 85% water. But somewhere in that physical brain, a mind functions. And through that mind, God communicates with us. For the only way in which God has chosen to communicate with mankind is not through the rest of our body, but he's chosen to communicate to us through the brain and the nerves which connect to the brain and send messages to control the rest of the body. That's how God communicates with me in order to restore the mind which I have lost and to help me to deal with the carnal, the satanic mind which I inherited by birth from my ancestor Adam and Eve. With that in mind now, let's look at the brain. Some time ago, I had a patient. He was a diabetic. And as you know, a diabetic has to take injections of insulin in order to lower the blood sugar so that you may function well. This was a patient who had come to church with me one Sabbath morning. I used to look after him in the endocrine clinic, and as a good patient, every morning he takes his injections of insulin. The sermon finished, and we left church, and we had to call by some friends in a very fashionable part of Kingston on our way to lunch. And as we got out of the car, they were having their lunch on the lawn outside, and this patient, who looked very well and was behaving quite normally, behaved very inappropriately. He began to pass urine in front of all the guests right at their gate. Made no attempt to do it privately. He just did it publicly. It was quite clear that something was wrong with his mind. But he looked all right. And so I put him into the car, and we drove very quickly to the hospital. The roads were clear. There were no trees along the road. There was no traffic. And as I drove along, he said to me, "Doctor, you're going to hit the trees. Why are you driving through the trees? Don't you know we're going to crash?" There were no trees. So I drove even faster, went to the outpatient department, got some sugar, some glucose solution in a syringe, and injected it into the vein. And within 10 seconds, he said, "We were at the sermon. When did the pastor finish? What are we doing here?" And I said, "Do you remember passing urine in front of those people when they were having their lunch?" And he said, "I would never do such a thing. I didn't do that. What are you talking about?" And I said, "What about the trees in the middle of the road that we nearly crashed into?" He said, "What trees? I can't remember any trees." And he had forgotten everything for the past hour, yet he behaved normally, and were it not for the inappropriateness of his behavior, you would have said all was well. But he was a different person. Totally different. Behavior had changed. His thinking patterns had changed. His thought processes had changed. Yet he didn't appear sick. What had happened? If we call this a brain cell or a neuron, of which there are 100 billion in our brain cells, 100 trillion, the chemical environment surrounding his neuron or his brain cell, something had happened within that chemical environment, or sometimes within, because the neuron itself is filled with water. Each brain cell is 85% water, and it is bathed with water. So the neuron does all its work in an environment of water. if there is no water, or if the composition of the water is not quite right, or if the water becomes too concentrated because it is dehydrated, or if it is overexpanded with water, and each of those changes produces appropriate changes within this environment of the cell, then the cell changes its behavior. Because our behavior is generated by electrical impulses generated within the neurons, and those impulses generated within the membrane of the cell are manipulated in such a way that they are sent along a nerve fiber to transmit whatever message the cell wants to transmit. More of that later. But in this lady's case, it was clear that the amount of sugar or glucose in the environment of the cell had fallen because our patient had taken an injection of insulin, but he did not bring his lunch to church. And so the blood levels of glucose went down and down and down. He forgot to eat. And of course, as the sugar went down, that also made him forget to eat. And he didn't realize that he needed to eat or that his lunch hour had passed. And so he completely ignored it. And as the blood sugar went down and the sugar in the environment of the cell went down, so it produced a change in his behavior. And he became a different person. But as soon as the blood sugar level went up, he went back to his normal self. Now, if your blood sugar should happen to go down, if I injected some insulin into you and your blood sugar went down, not all of you would pass urine inappropriately, though quite a number would do so without going to the bathroom. But Rosalind, who is so gentle, she may suddenly get up and pick up a chair and go right around the room using the chair as a weapon and knocking our heads until she killed a number of us. Because she would see us as soldiers attacking her. And then she wanted to be sure to kill us before we killed her. Once her blood sugar came back to normal, and she looked at all these corpses around the church, she said, "And who did that?" And we say, "Rosalind, you did it." And she says, "But you're crazy. How could I ever do such a thing? I didn't do it." And she would not know that she did it, and she'd have no recollection of it. Others might just leave this room and wander out into the street, totally lost. And when I say, "What's your name?" "I don't know." "Where are you?" "I don't know." "Where do you live?" "I don't know." And just around the corner, they are found wandering up and down the street, totally lost. So each one of us will behave in a different way depending on the response of our neurons to the fall in blood sugar. Two young ladies brought their mother to me once, and as an endocrinologist, they wanted me to sort out what was going on. The daughter said, "Please do something about my mother. We don't know what has happened to her." In our home, we had a helper who has lived with us for 25 years, and she brought us up children. Her name is Ruby. She's a part of the family. Last week, Mother got up one morning, and she said, "Ruby, I fire you on the spot. You leave this house immediately. I don't want you here because I know you're trying to kill me." After all the protestations, Ruby had to leave in tears. The members of the family were in tears because Ruby had done nothing like that. She went away. The next morning, Mother woke up and says, "Where is Ruby? Why isn't she here?" And the children says, "Mother, Can't you remember how disgracefully you fired her yesterday? And mother said, don't talk nonsense. I didn't do any such thing. Wherever Ruby is, you just find her and tell her to come back here immediately. She had no recollection that she had fired Ruby. As we looked at her and took an appropriate history, we discovered that her adrenal glands, which sit just on the top of her kidneys, and that adrenal gland makes cortisol, without which we cannot live. And that cortisol had failed to work for her adrenal glands were not functioning well due to some other disorder. And as a result, the cortisol, which controls the reabsorption of sodium from the kidney tubules, so that we do not lose too much sodium in the urine, for one of the functions of the kidney, in conjunction with the adrenal glands, is to maintain a normal sodium concentration in the body fluids, in the blood, so that it neither goes low nor high. Because she had very little cortisol, her output of sodium increased tremendously, so that the concentration of sodium in the bloodstream decreased appropriately, and therefore the sodium concentration in the chemical environment of the neuron, that sodium decreased. And as a result, she was a different person. And once we diagnosed it, and we replaced the appropriate hormone so that her sodium loss in her urine decreased and the sodium concentration in the blood increased to the normal, that lady was restored to normal. So a change in your sodium concentration of the body, whatever the cause, whether here or somewhere in the brain from the pituitary or due to kidney damage, that change will result in a behavioral change. And you say, I just don't know what has happened to this child. He's totally uncontrollable. Why can't he listen to me? Why can't he obey? Why has he changed? It may very well be due to changes in the chemical environment masquerading as personality changes. Sometimes the patient may have kidney failure. Let's say that there is a stone blocking the outflow of urine, and therefore, although the kidney is making urine, it cannot get out. Therefore, it accumulates in the kidney, raises the pressure in the kidney, so that the kidney can no longer filter the blood which is passing through the kidney. Therefore, the wastes from the body, mainly urea, resulting from the breakdown of protein, or uric acid, resulting from the breakdown of special proteins, if these cannot get out in the urine, which is their normal avenue of excretion, the levels rise in the blood. Therefore, as the urea goes up, probably due to renal failure, then the patient's behavior changes. And you go to visit your relative in the hospital, and when you go in, once the urea has passed a certain level, you say, "Hello, John." He'll say, "Who are you?" "I'm your mom. Don't you recognize me?" "You're not my mother. I've never seen you before. I don't want to see you." Once the urea level goes down again, he will treat you normally. And so the point I'm trying to establish is that in changing the chemical environment of the neuron, you will induce a change not only in your behavior, but in your perception of what is going on around you. In the early days of LSD, when young people used to take that drug, it changed the chemical environment in specific ways, which I'll talk about later. And then they would take a knife and they would begin stabbing themselves. Not that they wanted to stab themselves, but all they saw were giant rats with huge teeth. And these rats were jumping at them to eat them up. And as each rat would jump, they would stab the rat to kill the rat. And in so doing, they gave themselves multiple wounds, and they died. But there were no rats there, but they saw them because those images were created in their minds, in their brains, which we look at later. So with this principle being understood, I can now put a list here. If the amount of water in the cell goes down, or if you're overhydrated because the doctor gave you a drip, turn it on too high, you were not really with it, and it was just left to run, and the brain became overhydrated or dehydrated, it would change the viscosity, the thickness of all the solution inside the cell. And when the viscosity changes and it becomes very concentrated, then all the enzyme reactions which are occurring within the cell in order that the neuron might work well and transmit the right message, those reactions cannot proceed properly. Therefore, the behavior of your cell changes. So dehydration will do that. Overhydration will do it. If the levels of your carbon dioxide in the blood and therefore in the fluids bathing the cell goes up and therefore changes the acidity of the cell, the pH, it makes it too acid, then the cell will change. Like closing all your windows at night because you're very cold. And every window is tightly closed, and the door is tightly closed. So for the next 8 hours, you sleep in your room, using up the oxygen, breathing out carbon dioxide, and for those who sleep with a fire in the room, the fire itself consumes the oxygen in the room, so that as we get sleepy, which is right to get sleepy if you want to sleep, but as we sleep and the level of carbon dioxide rises, so it depresses our brain cells, so that though we sleep, we have not really slept. And of course, if it goes up too high, then when somebody breaks down the door tomorrow, they will find us deeply asleep and perhaps dead. But if we don't die, when we wake up, our cells are not thinking clearly because, one, they lacked oxygen and the carbon dioxide rose too much. So between those two, the behavior pattern changes. Let's take the blood flow. The brain, like all other organs, receives a good blood flow. What is the blood bringing to the brain cell? It brings nutrients and it brings oxygen. If anything happens to our blood vessels to decrease the flow of nutrients or oxygen, like getting a plaque, a large collection of saturated fats. Because when the body gets too much saturated fats from the wrong diet, what is it going to do with it? It has to find little corners in which to store this fat that the body doesn't want. So it tucks it everywhere, around the organs, inside organs, in between muscle fibers, and one of the most common places to put the fat as the fat travels in the blood, largely this form of cholesterol. I'll talk about that later on in the week. I won't elaborate on that yet. But as this cholesterol, in its abundance in the bloodstream, has nowhere else to go, it enters through a breach in the lining of the bloodstream and settles there and collects. So after a little time, we find a little collection of LDL cholesterol there, which we call a plaque. And as that plaque grows and enlarges, so the lumen, the space in the blood vessel to facilitate the flow of blood, becomes increasingly narrow. Now, eventually, it is going to be blocked. And when it is blocked and blood flow stops, then that neuron will die. That's a stroke. You have killed brain cells, which can't recover once they're dead. They're dead. They are the only cells in the body which cannot regrow. For you're born with all the brain cells you're ever going to have. There are just a few special ones that create new cells. But once they die permanently. And so once you destroy a collection of cells in the brain, whatever function that cell normally would do, you now lose that function because the blood flow has stopped, because the collection of fats in the walls of the arteries have caused a blockade or an occlusion. But before that moment of occlusion comes and you get a stroke, the fall in the level of the blood flow to the brain carrying nutrients and oxygen, since those fall, therefore, brain cell function will also fall. So let's take something now like vitamin B12 and folic acid. I'll refer to those later. Essential vitamins, among other things. They are vital for the proper functioning of neurons or of brain cells. If these nutrients are lacking, whether in the diet or because of poor blood flow, then it is not surprising if the patient develops dementia and begins to forget things, and the memory fails, and their behavior fails. I put this in to show the value of nutrition, so that nutritional changes in the chemical environment of the neurons play a vital role in your behavior. These are just samples of the way in which changes in the chemical environment will influence behavior patterns of the nerve cells by altering the electrical impulses which are generated in the nerve cells, and therefore changing the transmission of messages from one cell to the other. And as a result, we have changes in our behavior. It is at this level that we have control, because we really are in control of our body's nutritional status, how we treat it, what we put in. To a large extent, we control that area, and yet it is the area which is least controlled by human beings and therefore gives rise to all sorts of problems medically which ought not to be. Let's leave that for a while and talk about the cell. We're going to bring all of these together later. What does a neuron do, a nerve cell? Let's call that a nerve cell. That's the body of the cell, and there is the nucleus, which generates the controlling power that determines the activity of the nerve cell. And these branches are called dendrites. They're like branches of the tree. All of these, their purpose is to receive messages. But each nerve cell has only one fiber called the axon, and that fiber is the one that transmits the message. Each nerve cell, of which there are 100, did I say trillion nerve cells? Those are cells in the body. 100 billion nerve cells in the brain. Each one of those nerve cells connects with 10,000 other cells. So imagine 100 billion cells, and each one connects with 10,000 others, and they all interconnect. So you know how many pathways you have now within the brain, trillions and trillions of different pathways with a potential for doing all sorts of things. It's far more than we can ever use in a lifetime. When a child is born, he or she has all the nerve cells that they will ever have for life. And during childhood, the body has to determine how many of those nerve cells they will use. A child, although he has the same number of nerve cells, has far more dendrites, more than 100 times more dendrites, to receive messages than an adult. And during childhood, whatever is not used, the body severely prunes them. So that during childhood, if by a certain stage some are not used, it chops them up and destroys them. You'll never get them again. And during adolescence, it goes through another burst, and whatever isn't used, it chops them and it destroys them because they are non-functional. So right throughout childhood, many of these nerve cells are destroyed by the brain if they are not utilized. Let me give you an example. When a kitten is born, the kitten sees, not very well, but they see, because the nerve connections for sight are established. Now, as the light comes into the eye and travels along the nerve pathways to the brain, those pathways become established, like walking over a lawn along the same path. If you do it every day for a year, you'll form a permanent road. But if you walk on that lawn once a year, you won't find the path. Now, if you put a tape over the kitten's eyes so that no light enters, and you remove it after 3 months, then the kitten is permanently blind. He will never see again. Because those pathways for vision, when they found that they were not being utilized, the brain says, useless. Destroy them. Form other connections, because the stimulus for light is not there. So they prune them. Windows of opportunity during which certain tasks can only be performed at critical times in the child's development. Same thing for language. The neurons which connect for language are formed early. And when a child learns a language early, if you teach them 10 languages, they will speak the 10 languages fluently as if they were born in the 10 different countries. without an accent. But if those early pathways are not utilized, and at 25 he embarks on learning languages, although grammatically he may be correct, yet you can always say, ah, yes. He speaks English very well, but he's from France, and that one's from Germany, and this one is from South Africa. You can hear it. And however well they speak English, you know that it's different from another English-speaking person. For it is more difficult to establish pathways, or rather, I should say, the establishment of pathways for learning and speaking a language in older age groups take on different neurons from those which are used in childhood. So the brain is very busy receiving messages from 10,000 others directly and sending out messages through its main fiber, the axon. Now let us look at the axon and enlarge it. Here is a collection of nerve fibers whose job is to transmit a message, an electrical impulse. How does it do it? In the walls of the membranes, there are little pumps. I'll call them channels, but I'll call them here pumps, electronic pumps. And the job of these electronic pumps is to utilize the energy produced in the nerve membrane, the energy, and these pumps use that energy to take in chemicals like sodium or potassium or calcium and many others, and the integrity and the function of the nerve fiber is dependent on the function of these channels or electronic pumps, which are moved by the energy generated within the nerve membrane in order to move the chemicals in the right concentration across the nerve membrane, maintaining a balance within and without. That creates an electrical current that allows the message to be transmitted. But within the nerve fiber, you have a number of factories which generate all the chemicals that are needed by these pumps. It's a lot of work. Remember, when you change the chemical environment, you change the function of the nerve fiber. As the impulse travels down the axon, down the nerve fiber, then it comes to an end. That's where the nerve ends. And down here, we have the next nerve cell, which is waiting to receive the message. And when this neuron receives the message from here, then it now passes along its message along its own axon to transmit it to another neuron. Now, on the surface of the cell, there is a special structure, and we call that a receptor. All of this will come together in a moment. That receptor is specifically designed to respond to the message coming from this neuron. How does it respond? Within this nerve fiber, there are certain storehouses, and these storehouses we call vesicles. Within these vesicles, the nerve fiber stores neurotransmitters, a chemical that is manufactured within the nerve fiber, stored within the vesicles, and as the nerve impulse arises, it causes these vesicles to move to the surface of the nerve fiber. A door is opened, the neurotransmitter flows out, travels to the receptor, and it fits in to a little hole here, which is just the right size to receive it. And as the receptor as the transmitter touches the chemical, it awakens electrical impulses in this neuron, which then sends a message along to the next neuron. This junction here is called a synapse. It's a gap. But the gap is bridged by the neurotransmitter chemical produced here, traversing the gap and stimulating the receptor. If anything happens to the production of these neurotransmitters, if not enough is produced, if the wrong kind is produced, if we block their action by taking different kinds of drugs, so for instance, marijuana, nicotine, all kinds of drugs, often have their effect here by disturbing the action of the neurotransmitter, then the wrong message will be received by the subsequent neuron, and therefore the message sent to the body will be different. Some of these neurotransmitters stimulate. They cause heightened action. Some of these neurotransmitters inhibit. And our normal behavior consists of a balance between stimulation and inhibition. If, by chemicals introduced into the body, you block the neurotransmitters which will inhibit the transmission of messages, then your body is left with an overstimulation of those nerve fibers that have nothing to put the brakes on. So, for instance, if the neurotransmitters which make me sleep are missing because their production is interfered with, then the nerve cells that keep me awake are forever keeping me awake, so that I will stay awake for months and I just cannot sleep. And so we have patients who never sleep a wink for 3 months, and they get very sick, but they cannot sleep because the nerve cells in the brain which activates the waking mechanism will never switch off, because the neurotransmitters which ought to switch them off at night when it is time to sleep, they are missing, either because they are not being produced, for nutritionally they can't be, or if they are produced, we are blocking their function across the synapse so that they cannot work, or by our nutrition, we are altering the structure of the transmitter, of the receptor, so that the neurotransmitter cannot lock into the receptor. For the receptor behaves like a lock and key. Here is your receptor waiting to receive its neurotransmitter. In order for the neurotransmitter to fit in, this chemical has to take on the shape of a V to fit in. But if you alter its structure, and it's just not made quite the right way, because something has happened to the machinery in the neuron which manufactures the neurotransmitter, and it doesn't turn out quite right. Like having a shirt with one long sleeve and one short sleeve when there were meant to be 2 long sleeves. If it doesn't fit right, then they cannot connect. So if the neurotransmitter happens to be shaped in a circular fashion, it will never fit into the receptor V-shaped, and so nothing will happen. So we have it in our power to control the production of neurotransmitters, whether they inhibit or whether they stimulate. And when we disturb this balance, then our whole behavior is changed. Later on, I'll touch on this again when we come to deal with coffee and tea and other stimulants which make us feel good. And we feel good because the pleasure centers are stimulated. But we are feeling good at a price. Because while we're allowing the effects of stimulation to override itself, we are also doing great damage to the receptors which function by the inhibitory pathways. And that can produce great problems in our lives. Now, one more thing about this nerve fiber. The more you give it that stimulus, the more accustomed that nerve fiber becomes to the message. So you run this message along it every day, and the nerve fiber says, yes, I become accustomed to this, and after a while, it becomes a reflex. The more you walk across this lawn, the more the road becomes established. So you don't have to do much work to keep that road going. It just functions even without thinking. And with the slightest message, the stimulus is transmitted. So it becomes accustomed to it. And the more a particular message runs along a fiber, then the more the synapse enlarges with practice, so that you develop bigger and bigger nerve terminals. And the greater the size, the greater their efficiency in doing that particular job. So a pianist who spends hours practicing, you notice when they give a concert, they don't look in the book. And while they're playing and their fingers are flying all over the keys, if you talk to them, they will carry on a conversation, but their hands will just fly over the keys, not because they're thinking of it, but because they have an idea what they should be playing. The nerve fibers find it so easy to do the job because they have done it over and over and over again. Consequently, you will not be surprised to find that good habits established early and repetitively done remain. Conversely, bad habits, repetitively done and begun at an early age, remain with you for a very long time. And we do not have to wait until we're born or until we're reasoning to have this thing happening to us. When the baby is in the mother's womb and these connections are dying to make friends with another nerve cell, they just don't sit there doing nothing. They want to connect. They want to connect. And if the mother's habits of eating and drinking or sleeping or thinking releases certain chemicals in her bloodstream, which goes into the baby's bloodstream and damages the sensitive neurons that are waiting to make a connection, then that child may develop all kinds of unusual connections which don't serve the child very well. For example, when the mother who is pregnant decides that she wants to drink beer every day, it doesn't kill her, but the baby's cells are sensitive. And so when the drug goes in, it destroys the baby's nerve fibers and electronic pumps, distorts them completely, so that when they have to migrate from one part of the brain to another part to do a job, sometimes they don't quite get there, and they develop in the wrong place. Or sometimes they overshoot where they ought to be, and they develop in the wrong place. And the child's brain cells and nerve connections become totally distorted. So when the child is born, they are born with the fetal alcohol syndrome. 1, they're mentally retarded. 2, the ears are the wrong way. 3, the eyes are just in different places. Something is wrong with the heart. They just look odd, and they just don't develop. That child is permanently scarred because their emerging brain cells were poisoned by the chemical environment created by the mother's habits of eating and drinking, and so she herself damages the child. Now, the findings may not be overtly manifest, but the child may just not do well in school. The child may be hyperactive, quite uncontrollable, just can't learn, difficult to retain, more prone to infections, and just doesn't fit in easily with the other children. Damage done before birth. And now, lest the fathers think that it's only the mother's health that damages the fetus, we're quite wrong. For in some mysterious way, the father also can transmit the characteristics of his genes, which control his nerve cells, to the child. And the child is thereby affected. So far, what is the message? Our brain is made up of 100 billion neurons, each one connecting with 10,000 others, so the connections are infinite. Each cell receives messages from different cells, and as the message comes from this cell, it forms a little bouton, that nerve ending, which grows and grows the more this fiber is utilized to send messages. It receives it at the receptor there, takes it to the cell takes the message, analyzes it, and passes on an appropriate response. And this response, let's say it's the cell which makes my finger move. That message doesn't just go to my finger to make it move, but it is transmitted to 9,999 other cells within my brain, so that if you prick me with a pin and I'm not looking, I will not just do, if you prick me in the index finger, I will not just say, if you prick me well, my whole body will jump. Everything will react, and I might utter a sound, because that message was saying not just pull your finger away, but it makes me utter a sound, I may begin to cry, and the rest of my body feels the pain because of the widespread interconnections. So our habits affect the whole of our body and leaves permanent effects depending on how often we send that particular message. Now, what does this have to do now with my behavior? If we look at the brain from the side, if you look at the brain from the side, you know that from the front, you know that your brain is divided into two halves, the right and the left, and they are connected by a bridge of nerve fibers. Both brains really work quite differently. You know that the right brain controls the left half of the body, and the left brain controls the right half of the body. So everything I do on this side comes from here, and everything I do on this side comes from here. When you block a blood vessel, which is taking blood to the left brain, and let's say a clot or a plaque blocks the flow, then that brain dies. When that brain dies, the right side of my body dies. It will not come back again. So if that happens to me, this whole side will become paralyzed. And then I'll walk, but I'll drag the right along. It can't do anything else, for the brain can't tell it to do anything else. The cells are dead. So though it is there, it receives no messages. And even if you pricked it, it couldn't move because it doesn't feel anything. And when I'm dressing myself, quite often, if one side of my body is dead, I will wash this side, and I will put on my trousers this side, and I will look after this side, but I'll completely ignore this side because I don't know that it is there. It just doesn't exist. For some people, of course, depending on where the stroke is. The two halves do their own thing. In the left side, it tends to be more analytical, logical, manually skillful. Its dexterity is very highly achieved. On the right, I am creative, I am artistic, I love music, I write. I have intuition, I feel things. Over here, I don't feel anything, I'm so logical about it. But it's logic without feeling. But in you and me, when we're functioning right, these nerve fibers transmit messages between the two halves so very rapidly that the two halves, though different, become one. It's like a marriage. The two become one. However, when you slice down these nerve fibers and separate the two function differently. So you will say to the left brain, what do you want to become? And the person or the left brain will say, I want to become an engineer. But when you ask the right brain, when you grow up, what would you like to become? And the right brain will say, I want to become a poet. For the right brain knows nothing of wanting to be an engineer. And the left brain knows nothing of wanting to be a poet. But when they come together, and you say, what do you want? The right brain says, I want to be a poet. The left brain says, well, I want to be an engineer. But since I am the dominant hemisphere, I am the stronger one. For all the wishes of your being a poet, we are going to be an engineer. Because in each one of us, one half of the brain is dominant. And it is the dominant one that has the final say unless something happens to the dominant one and it just isn't functioning well, then the right one takes over. In some people, of course, both brains are equally dominant, and so at one period of their life, they're an excellent engineer. At another period of their life, they're an excellent poet, and sometimes the two come together and they write poetry within the field of engineering. Like Michelangelo, a great doctor, a great artist, a great engineer, a great inventor, a great anatomist, and a great musician, and a great painter. All kinds of things at different times of his life. And so was Mozart. Both brains were developed very well, so that he was very creative in his musical development, but earlier on, he had developed the left brain and developed the skill for playing very well. Now, we can't determine that because that is genetic. But the way we treat our bodies, both when the baby is in the womb and after the baby is born, determines to a large extent what functions our brain manifests. But if we damage the chemical environment of the nerve cells, trouble. Now, let's look at the brain now from the side. Here is the brain. This is the front, and that is the back. Right at the back of my brain, in fact, throughout my brain, my neurons are not all the same. They are arranged in little collections or modules, and each collection has its special function. It's arranged to do a particular job. So right behind here, this is where I see. I see at the back of my brain. It's not my eyes that see. My eyes let in the light. But they go right to the back here, and that's where I see. So if you took a hammer and damaged right here at the back of my brain, I would not see anything, even though my eyes are moving and the light is going in. For the images will not be formed. So when I become blind, I am blind in the eye. On the left side of my brain, right down here on the left side, that is where I speak. My ability to form words and to speak comes from this collection here. And if you destroy that collection, I cannot speak. But I will understand, for my understanding of what you say is here. That is where I understand. And of course, I have to understand before I can speak. So as you speak to me, I understand here, and I'm able to speak there. If, however, you destroy that part, but I can still speak, you'll say to me, Don, what did you eat for breakfast this morning? I say, Don. Where did you go this morning when you left the house? And I will say, Don. What is the color of your hair? Don. What clothes are you wearing? Don. And I'll just keep saying the same word all the time because I can speak, but I have no understanding of what you're saying. Right here, this is where there is control of all my actions. All motor actions is transmitted here. My legs are on top, and my face is down the bottom. So if you destroy the cells down here, then the muscles of my face won't work, but my legs can still kick. But if you destroy the ones up here, my legs will be paralyzed, but the rest of my body will be all right. But if you destroy the whole lot, then all of me becomes paralyzed. Over this side, that is where I feel. These are my sensory areas, and all my feelings are consciously perceived there. What am I saying? All over the brain, every action of my body has its area in my brain. And if you destroy that spot, that function goes. Whether you destroy it by bad nutrition, bad oxygenation, and not enough water, or by disease, or by blocking the blood supply, whatever. Once that part dies, that particular function disappears. So I have my hearing area, I have my memory areas, and everything in my body has its place in the brain. But there's something more important than that. In the mid-1800s, an unfortunate American engineer, highly paid, very bright, was doing his normal job of laying the dynamite in the rocks of some part of the Midwest to create a railway line. He was very skilled at the job, and in the job, you made a little hole in the rock, a little crevice, for you wanted to blast the rock. And then, at the bottom of the crevice, you place a little gunpowder. And then over the gunpowder, you place a layer of sand. And then once the sand and the gunpowder are in place, you then insert a metal rod. And that was about 3 feet long, half an inch wide. But in doing so to blast the rock, he became a little bit absent-minded, forgot to put in the sand, put in the metal rod, and began to tap the gunpowder. And before long, the rod shot out of the hole. And because his face was nearby, it went under the bone of his left cheek, traveled behind the left eye, and shot out through the top of his forehead and landed many yards away. He fell to the ground for a moment, quickly recovered consciousness, and got up and walked home. And he lived for another 15 years. But during those 15 years, he was never the same. His name was Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage. From that day on, he became a tramp. He could never work. He could never make a decision. He had no will. He could never do anything. He abandoned his family, never saw them again. He became exceedingly promiscuous, without any inhibitions. And he carried on his promiscuous behavior anywhere he felt like. His language became foul. He had never sworn before in his life, but now every second word was a swear word. He once held a high position in church, and after the accident, he had nothing more to do with God. No church, no mention of God. He lost all his religious inclinations. Totally different person. Once we had that gentleman, later on, the psychiatrist discovered a new method of making hyperactive people quiet. And so they experimented in the 1900s by taking a knife and cutting down here and severing the frontal lobe right behind your forehead, cutting off the frontal lobe from the rest of your brain. Now, when Phineas Gage died, and they looked at him, they discovered that the iron had gone straight through from behind his eye and created a path right through his frontal lobe. That's why he didn't die, because the vital structures are further back. So it missed those, but it cut off his frontal lobe. Now, when the doctors began doing a prefrontal lobotomy to separate the frontal lobe from the rest, we then realized that in the frontal lobe, we have the area of your will. That's where your willpower lies. Your ability to make a choice, make a decision. 2, that was the area of your motivation. Phineas Gage had no motivation whatever. He just tramped the streets for 13 years, picking food out of the rubbish bin. We now know that that is the area for your spirituality. And all peoples who have lost their frontal lobe lose all taste for religion. They're just not religious anymore, when once they used to be. They can no longer think in the abstract. It is the area for your intelligence, and it is the area for your reasoning abilities. You can work things out, and you can understand why. If you say to a patient before her frontal lobes are cut, suppose you borrowed your friend's watch and you lost it, what would you do? And she would say, I'll buy another and replace it. Right. But after the frontal lobe is gone, you say to her, you borrow a friend's watch and you lost it, what will you do? And she says, I'll borrow another watch. There is no relationship to morality. They can't understand it. And so in terms of reasoning and in terms of morality and sexuality, all of that changes. And they're exhibitionists. No inhibitions at all. And you can't reason with them because they don't understand what you're saying. In this frontal lobe, it is the area where you are self-aware. You know who you are. You are conscious about your individuality. And you can make decisions about who you are and what you ought to do. Now, that is the function of the frontal lobe. And all of these, there are areas which are discretely pinpointed for each of these, but of course, all of these areas interconnect with thousands of other areas to make the final decision. And of course, up here is where you make decisions. When it is gone, you are extremely indecisive. What happens when you damage your frontal lobe? You don't have to damage it. We don't do this operation anymore. But one doesn't have to wait on that or wait for an unfortunate accident like Phineas Gage. If you damage the chemical environment, if you damage the blood supply by causing your blood vessels to be blocked off because your diet is wrong, if you take, let's say, marijuana and you disturb the neurotransmitters, whether they are manufactured in the right quantities or not, or they are manufactured but their structure is slightly altered so they will not fit into E and transmit their messages, or whether you take certain drugs like coffee, which knock off certain receptors, whether those that inhibit or those that stimulate, you knock off one and leave the other, then that will finally determine your behavior. While I stand before you, I'm perfectly at ease. And this is because my muscles, some receptors say move, and the others say stop and maintain this posture. But if you should take away my pathways that inhibit, the pathways that produce dopamine, a neurotransmitter, and you should leave the pathways that stimulate acetylcholine, if you knock those out, then I will always be like this, and I'll develop Parkinson's. I can't help it, because my acetylcholine pathways are making my muscles jerk all the time, and there's no dopamine to say stop. But when I give you dopamine, then you stop. And when the dopamine wears out, then you go back to shaking again. So the people who develop Parkinson's, their neurons in specific areas that make dopamine, they are dead. They won't come back. And so they will always shake. Message. These areas of my brain that control my personality, if I change their environment by my lifestyle, I will change my health and I will change myself emotionally. Last bit, emotionally. You say, now, but you didn't mention anything about emotions here. Because all these things in my frontal lobe I've dealt with. Here I see, over here, I integrate all these functions. So when I see the apple, but I want to talk about it, my visual pathways send messages to my understanding, sends messages to my motor area, and I tell you, this apple is so beautiful, I want to give it to you. Here, my memory and hearing. If I put a needle in here and stimulate it with an electric current, you'll just begin to tell me jokes. And if I stimulate another area, it will transport you 10 years back or 20 years back when you were in school, and you'll begin to describe to me everything that is happening on that day, recorded in the cell that I have touched. And you'll describe everything. Your mother sent you to school. I said, now here is your sandwich, Mary. Don't forget to eat your banana. What time are you coming back? Bye, mother. Oh, there is Auntie over there. Lovely to see you, Auntie. And the moment I stop stimulating, you're right back here with me. And you have no memory of what you just said. But while you're seeing those things and talking about it, and I said, now, John, are you feeling any pain? And you'll say, no. you can come back immediately and you answer me and you can lock off that memory cell and respond to me, and having answered me, I keep stimulating it and you go right back to that day 10 years ago and you unfold all the events. This area integrates all of these things. But then now, emotion. And this will bring together everything. Your brain function is organized into different areas. Right at the top, we have the cortex. The cortex means the shell. Those are the surface brain cells. They carry all the functions I have just talked about. Here is the conscious brain. I know what I'm doing. I decide what to do. I make a decision, and I feel good about it. It's my decision. But directly underneath the cortex, in the inner brain, we have what is called the limbic system. It means on the border of the cortex, the limbic system. Another collection of nerve cells, and that is the unconscious brain, or the emotional brain. It has nothing to do with my control. I just can't help it. I'm not conscious of it. And that is where I feel fear. I feel afraid. I get angry. This is where I have expressions, feelings of tenderness. This is where my sexuality finds its physical expression. That's where I feel sensual. This is where I learn. My learning cells are largely here, and my cells of memory are largely here. So fear is registered and generated. Sex, appetite. Here I have an unconscious desire for food, whether I want to eat or not, whether I want to be anorexic or bulimic. I don't get up one day and say, now, I want to be anorexic. It's something that I find I am simply anorexic because my desire for food is either gone or it is the other way. The balance has gone. And all the cells that control my emotional status are there. So when you prick those cells, I will lash out at you. And I will swear at you. And I will punch you down. And I might even shoot you. Now, if this isn't here, and I have these feelings of rage, I am not aware of it. I do not know. They just go on. And they switch on when they want. It's out of my control. But this area is always sending messages to my area of will and consciousness. Consciousness? Consciousness. Which lies up here. And the message comes and says, you are angry. And I become conscious that I am angry. And I become conscious that I'm sweating and my muscles are tight and I'm breathing fast and my blood pressure is up. I am angry. But now, I have to decide what to do, because from my decision-making area, I can send now a message, and I can either say, do it, knock him out, yes, give him a good punch, and feel good about it, or I can develop a pathway which says, you know, Don, you really want to knock him out, but because of so-and-so, it is not right. Turn the other cheek. That's what I want to do. And I make a decision to do that. And so what I do, I send back a message along an inhibitory pathway. I form a new connection of dendrites working through another neuron that sends a message to this cell which makes me want to knock you out. And it says, no, inhibit. Inhibit the impulse which is saying shoot. This one says shoot, this one says inhibit. And the final message down here, which is shoot or inhibit, depends on the final decision of my cortical neurons in the area of decision and willpower. Now, of course, if I haven't had time to develop those pathways, I might punch you the first time. Feel sorry about it. The second time, by God's grace, I developed this new pathway. It's very young. It isn't well established yet, and it doesn't do good things just like a reflex. It really has to work and work and work, and in time, when that pathway has been exercised enough, it develops a reflex. And it may even become the dominant pathway, controlling my natural pathways for anger with which I am born. I don't develop that. I don't develop my emotions. And when a baby cries and bawls and does all the things that babies do without any awareness, it is because their cortex is not yet developed. They can't reason, they can't analyze, they can't do anything, because it is their emotional center which is fully at play, and it just makes the baby does anything they want to do. But as the child grows, you begin to teach it and train it so that the cortical neurons may be stimulated to develop those connections which lead to self-control. But the anger and the fear don't go away until you get a brand new brain. And that happens when Jesus comes. So I've got to stick with my old brain. It will always be with me. Whether I kill some cells with alcohol or with marijuana or with a poor diet, or whether I develop self-control through the grace of God, the old brain is there. But the new controls have been developed by the exercise of the will and of the decision-making area. And once that is developed, a new mind, new thinking, new goals, then when Jesus comes, he gives me a physically new body like his to house the new mind which the Holy Spirit has recreated within me. And with his help, I have exercised until it becomes dominant. The messenger of the Lord says, when we yield our will to God's will, for that's the only thing we can really yield to him. We can't yield him our fear and our anger and our sexuality and all of those things. We can't. They're kind of unconscious. That's our heritage. But I can yield him my will. That's the only thing that God cannot take from me. Or won't. He says, that's yours. Do you want to? Yes. Can you do it? No. But if I give you my will, which is so weak, the spirit of prophecy says, God will take our weak and feeble wills, he'll refine it, ennoble it, sanctify it, and unite it with his own omnipotent power. And then give it back to us and says, no, use it. Use it to do those things. It's my power because you have no power. But take my power and make it yours and use it to do those things which the Holy Spirit has put within the new mind that he has given you. The new mind has a new direction, new motives, new goals. It is still a baby, not yet strong, but it can grow and be strengthened by the exercise of my power in line with your feeble, weakened will. And he promises, as long as we yield that to him, the rest is his. But we keep the old brain. And if we don't keep yielding every day and growing in grace, the old brain will once again reawaken if we feed it with the right things. So if we put ourselves back into those areas that give the wrong stimulus to the old desires that trouble us, it will awaken, and the old man returns. Until we decide to go back to God and feed the new man. Feed it, and keep the old man inactive. And in time, some old pathways die. But in others, it doesn't die. It sleeps. It sleeps, always waiting for an opportunity to wake up. But it doesn't go away. But as long as, by God's help, we develop new controlling pathways, new inhibitory pathways that achieve dominance over the old, easy pathways of getting angry from my emotional brain, I can overcome. For the ability for the brain to do that lies in the hand of God. So, my conscious brain, my cortex, where I have conscious control. My limbic system, my emotional brain, over which I have no control except as it sends messages and receives messages from my conscious cortex. And the last part which I have to deal with is down below. That is my autonomic brain. That is in my hypothalamus, right down here, just above my spinal cord. And here, the autonomic brain deals with heart rate, digestion, feeling hungry or feeling full, sex, weight balance. It is not I that determine why I am like that, but somewhere in my hypothalamus, it determines my average weight. And so for the past many years, I am the same weight. For it is my hypothalamus which has set this level and says, Don, this is how you will be. Now, if things go wrong there, between my appetite center and my satiety center, I may find myself overeating against my control because the cells that say, Don, stop, are not working. And the impulse is coming from the stomach, which says, full, full, full. If the hypothalamus is not responding to the stomach, I will eat and eat and eat and become a glutton. That's right. And not long ago in the States, a young man of about 32 died from overeating. He was 660 pounds, age 32, and he died shortly after he had eaten a whole suckling pig. So he died. But he had been like that all his life. Just couldn't stop. Couldn't stop. For something went wrong in the mechanisms, and his stomach could not, his brain could not tell him, stop. For there's an error in our brain to say eat, and there's an error which says enough. And other cells control the balance between those two areas, which finally at the cortex determines what I do about that next plate of food. But if the chemical environment is disturbed, and I'm eating wrongly, exercising wrongly, drinking wrongly, and if I create poisons in my own body, which I can, when fear comes through my cortex, flies down to my limbic system, stimulates my autonomic nervous system, and as a result of the fear, my heart rate goes up, I sweat, I pee, I can't control my bowels, I tremble, and everything happens to me. What's happening? These impulses through my autonomic nervous system is going right across to my kidney and going right to my adrenal and causing my adrenal to send out lots and lots of adrenaline and cortisol, which should be used only for emergency situations, but if those become very high in my blood, although they are good, yet in prolonged concentrations, they feed back to my brain and block certain neurotransmitters and overstimulate other transmitters, and so my body lives in a state of permanent stress. So my cortisol is overworking, and my heart is overworking, and my stomach is underworking, and everything is gone wrong. So that when this is not working, my body suffers. And I will die from a heart attack, though nothing is wrong with my heart, because by my own fear and chronic fear, I am generating chronic stress with chronic elevations of catecholamines, which are normally good for me. But if they are too much, they will kill me. And so I either have to find a way to deal with the fear up here, or I can say to the doctor, please take out my adrenals, remove them. So I have surgery, adrenals gone. And the heart is beating too fast. Well, put in a pacemaker, slow the heart down, and give me a pill to stimulate my appetite. And I go through all of those procedures, doing all of those things, and the real cure, go to the cause. Go to the fear center and see what can be done to assist the body in developing new control pathways to get the body back in equilibrium. And that power ultimately lies with God. But it needs my cooperation. And if I don't know what to ask him for, and I'm not aware of how he has made my body, then life can become very terrifying, very confusing. And that's why he asks us to understand our bodies, to learn the laws, to live in harmony with the laws. The healing of our bodies does not come from drugs or food or any magic. The healing only comes from God, who has equipped the body to be self-managing. God manages it. But he says, I want you to cooperate with me. There are certain things you need to eat, certain habits of life you need to adopt. And as you do that, you will create within your own bodies an environment which is conducive to my healing power. He will not heal you when the body continues in a state of turmoil. But what he says, I forgive you. Your sin is taken away. Go, sin no more. That is the key to healthy living. I'm overdue. I must stop. I hope that has given you an overview of a background against which we will look at water and the diet, and to show you what water really is. I know most people don't drink. Most people suffer terrible effects of not being adequately hydrated, not the least being the effect of dehydration on their reasoning powers, on their willpower, their decision-making, and on their spirituality. And during this week, we'll be looking more critically at the physiology of these simple things to enable us to live a well-worth, balanced, enjoyable life in the years that God has allotted to us.